Hi there, it's Jeff back again with another Tutor revision video. This time let's turn our attention to environmental economics and think about the really important idea of the tragedy of the commons. Well, the tragedy of the commons is basically where individuals acting in their own self-interest often overuse and eventually deplete a shared common pool resource, and that can lead to significant collective harm for a community or a wider society. And the concept was initially popularised by ecologist Garrett Hardin, who wrote a seminal 1968 paper, which was by and large about rapid population growth. But the paper highlighted the challenges of managing scarce resources, such as air and water, fisheries and grazing lands, which in theory should be replenishable and renewable, which often come up against severe pressure. Hence the tragedy of the commons. So it's basically a classic example of environmental market failure, where externalities, often from consumption or production or both, are not accounted for. And that leads to an over-exploitation of shared resources. And the tragedy of the idea is a way of trying to explain how unregulated, poorly managed access to resources can lead to, for example, overfishing and a decline in sustainable yields in fishing communities. Deforestation, which of course we see around the world, and air and water pollution, which then threatens the reliability and the safety of water supplies and air quality. The tragedy arises because individuals tend, operating in their own self-interest, to prioritise immediate personal gains, their own marginal private benefit, and they prioritise that over the long-term sustainability of the resource. One thinks of some examples: the depletion of fish stocks, tuna and cod, due to unregulated illegal fishing at scale. And of course the classic example of this was in the 1990s with the absolute collapse of cod fishing in Newfoundland. Deforestation, of course, the clearing of rainforests for farming, for logging, for cattle ranching in the Amazon rainforest, something that the world is paying attention to, trying to do something about, contributing, of course, to the loss of biodiversity and accelerated climate change. And the overuse of shared water resources, such as rivers or aquifers, leading to depletion. This picture, of course, is the famous picture of the shrinking of the Aral Sea in Central Asia due to over-irrigation across many years. So tragedy of the commons is essentially a form of environmental market failure. And please do add those three examples to your study notes. So what are the root causes? One is open access, common pool resources. So when resources are freely accessible, so grazing land or common pool water, aquifers, there's no incentive necessarily for people on their own to conserve or manage them sustainably. Okay, if I add a few more cattle to the pasture, I get some benefit, but there's no real cost to me. And a good example of that is unregulated fishing in international waters. Second root cause is short-term rationality over long-term public interest. So individuals focusing on maximising their own benefits in the short term, herders overgrazing on a shared pasture. And the really important key point here is the lack of well-defined and properly protected property rights. So without ownership rights, there's little incentive for people to take responsibility for the resource, the common pool's upkeep. Pollution of public rivers due to the absence of clear custodians. One thinks about the incredible incidence and cost of water, river and beach pollution in the UK. It is an example of the tragedy of the commons. And fundamentally, it's due to a lack of investment by water utilities, but also regulatory failure at a huge level and government failure. And that's the fourth point, that weak, insufficient regulations and penalties fail to limit resource extraction or pollution. Good example, there will be regulations that just simply don't work in preventing excessive groundwater extraction. Those are the causes. What can you do about it? Let's just finish by thinking about this. Well, one is to adopt the economics approach and say, well, incentives matter. So perhaps there are some market-based solutions. Carbon pricing, cap and trade for carbon emissions. Tradable quotas used by countries such as Iceland and Norway for fisheries, where you cap the amount that can be caught, and then people can trade the right to fish basically assigning rights, property rights that can be bought or sold to maintain sustainable limits. It's been very effective. Some people think that the solution is either to go down the much tougher regulation, perhaps even government-imposed, government-owned resources, so state at the level of the state. Others go the other way, so the way to approach this is to privatise, assigning property rights to individuals, groups to encourage stewardship and accountability. Eleanor Ostrom's great work was to think about the importance of social norms in institutions and the potential for community management, collaboratively coming together to manage resources based on shared rules, social norms and community enforcement mechanisms. And there have been some good examples of where that has worked to sustainably manage common pool resources. And you might then think about, instead of taxing the bad, subsidising the good. So governments providing more money to incentivising green technologies, income payments to farmers who maintain the land, protect the land, so sustainable farming, and of course income payments to prompt and accelerate investment in conservation. There are things that you can do to overcome the tragedy of the commons.